Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Bob again, and we're now ready for another chapter, or the finishing part of the chapter of The Hobbit, of Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire, which is chapter 6. So, we left off where the wolves were gathering together. So, there were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins, on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against the wolves, especially the evil packs that lived under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains over the edge of the wild on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said, and it became a proverb, though we now say out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees, quick!" cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low, or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, you can guess, and up they went as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed, from a safe distance, if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down, like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Feely and Keely were at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were more comfortable in a huge pine, with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Bifur, Bofer, Bomber, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree in which they could not climb, a large pine tree standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo? He could not get into any tree, and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk, like a rabbit that had lost its hole and has a dog after it. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dory. "Down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls all around them now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dory," he called, and for Dory was lowest down in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was really a decent fellow, in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch, and hung his arm down as far as ever he could. So Dory climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden there was 100 eyes looking at them. Still Dory did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered up off his shoulders into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself. Only just in time. A wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute there was a whole pack of them, yelping all around the tree and leaping up at the trunk, with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild are named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and the wind, and with wolves all around below waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dory and Bilbo were, and they went sniffling all about until they had smelled out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle was a great grey wolf. He spoke to them in the dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it, Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, and indeed it was. Every now and then all the wargs in the circle would answer their great chief all together, and their dreadful clamor almost made the hobbit fall out of his pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often help one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from their mountains unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I'm glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often get the wolves or the wargs to help them, and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo, and the wizard for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had been of late making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in, among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if there were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned, with the goblins' help, to come by night to upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left the next day. All would have been killed except the few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. There was dreadful talk to listen to, and not only because of the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them here in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen and had come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans down into the valleys, and then the goblins and wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people wake suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape, any rate not until the morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would come on down from the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place indeed, and had not yet escaped at all. All the same, he was not going to let them have it all their own way, though he could not do very much stuck up in a tall tree, with wolves all around in the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the tree. Then he set one alight with a bright blue fire, and threw it whizzing down among the circle of the wolves. He struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, one in red, and one in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle, and went off in colored sparks and smoke. A specially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose, and he leaped in the air 10 feet, then rushed around and around the circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The wolves, dwarves, and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves were terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was the most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got on their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, about all the glade, wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their backs, while those that were burning were running about howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away, and they led off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. "What's all this uproar in the forest?" said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting, black in the moonlight, at the top of a lonely pinnacle of rock in the eastern edge of the mountains. "I hear wolves' voices. Are the goblins at mischief in the woods?" He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leapt up to follow him. They circled up in the sky and looked down upon the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles have keen eyes, and can see small things at a great distance. The Lord of the Eagles in the misty mountains had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking, and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below, even in the moonlight. So he could not. So though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves, and see the tiny flashes of fire, and hear the howling and yelping came up faint from far beneath him. Also he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets, as long lines of the wicked folk crept down the hillsides from their gate and wound into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel. But the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins nor fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they do not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves, and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats and drive them from the mountains. Tonight, the Lord of the Eagles was summoned with curiosity to know what was afoot. So he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and around, they came down, down, down towards the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing, too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves had caught fire and fled into the forest that set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on the eastern side of the mountains there had been little rain for some time. Yellowing bracken, fallen branches, deep piled pine needles, here and there dead trees, were soon in flames. All around the clearing of the wild warg's fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling around the trunks, cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, and their tongues hanging out, their eyes shining as red and fierce as the flames. So we will stop there as we go into part 3 of this chapter. It's a long chapter. We'll stop there. Very interesting chapter. It's a little bit different than the movie, if you've seen the movie of The Hobbit, isn't it? And I think you'll find that as we go further, you'll find even more differences between the book and the movie. But I think you'll find it quite interesting. So this is Mr. Bob. I hope you enjoy the reading, and we will talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.